Good afternoon, Miss Winnie. Now I'm Chloe Liow.
I'm Yvonne Siew.
And I'm Kwan Ying.
We will start our presentation about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on global financial service and financial mobility in developing countries. Next. Next slide. So COVID-19 is not only a global pandemic and public health crisis, it has also severely affected the global economy and financial market. Significant reduction in income, a rise in unemployment, and disruption in the transportation, service, and manufacturing industry are among the consequences of the disease mitigation measures that has been implemented in many countries. It has become clear that most governments in the world underestimate the risk of rapid COVID-19 spread and were mostly reactive in their crisis response. As disease outbreaks are not likely to disappear in the near future, proactive international action are required to not only save life but also protect economic prosperity. So next. Okay, the COVID-19 impact on investment sector. So before the COVID, according to the World Investment Report 2018, global foreign direct investment, which is FDI, flow fell by 23% to 1.43 trillion in 2018. The fall was caused in the part by a 22% decrease in the value of cross-border mergers and acquisitions. But FDI flow to developing Asia remains stable at 476 billion. The region regained its position as the largest FDI recipient in the world. FDI to Latin America and the Caribbean rose 8% to reach 101 billion, lifted by the region's economic recovery. This was the first rise in 6 years, but inflow remained well below the 2011 peak during the commodity boom. The COVID-19 pandemic has a severe impact on international investment flow, including investment directly to the Sustainable Development Goals. Despite varying impact across regions and development group, the global FDI inflow fell by 42% in 2020, reaching an estimate of 859 billions only. Falling flows to Europe and the North America contribute to the greatest decline with more than 100% and 46%. But FDI flow fell by only 4% in developing Asia. So this, as a result of this regional difference, the share of developing economy increased to 72% of the world total FDI inflow. Next. Okay, the COVID-19 pandemic impact all types of investment. The greenfield investment project announcement is decreased by 35%. Cross-border mergers and acquisition is decreased by 10%, and new international project finance deal was 2% lower. In developing economy, mergers and acquisition sales in Asia rose by 31%, while those in Latin America and Caribbean dropped by 67% and Africa's 45% fell. Announced that Greenfield project reached an estimate of 547 billion in 2020. It's a decline of 35% compared to 2019. So the largest decline took place in developing economy, which is Latin America and the Caribbean, for 46% drop. The international project finance used for large infrastructure projects that require multiple investors is also weak. So in contrast to overall FDI, the decline in gold-relevant investment was much greater in developing and transition economy than in developed country. Next. Hey, wait. Example of the FDI. The pandemic has driven The pandemic has driven up investor sentiment in the pharmaceutical sector while having a significant negative impact on non-pharmaceutical sector. So the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the financial market of China is substantial. Shanghai composed dip by 7.7%. Which back to slide. Back again. After one slide. Okay. So for the investor, previous slide, just now that one. Okay. So for the investor sentiment behavior finance theories imply a considerable impact of the psychological factor of the investor on the financial market. And besides that, the COVID-19 pandemic and its economic impact, finding the several impacted countries register a 6 drop and an 8 drop in GDP and consumption. The outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic interrupt the product supply chain, and the global economy is in phase of a recession. The fear and anxiety from the pandemic may drive investors to sell stock and to cause price fluctuation. Next. So the COVID-19 impact the FDI sector. In an attempt to control the spread of the COVID-19 virus, many countries introduced social distancing and lockdown order and imposed entry bans on foreign. According to the International Monetary Fund, the global economy in 2020 contracted 3.2% and global trade by 8.3%. And according to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, global FDI flow dropped by 35% to 1 trillion in 2020 from 1.5 trillion in 2019. So when a country in the global value chain suffer a big COVID-19 outbreak leading to shutdowns of its factories, the entry global supply chain can be disturbed. To minimize and diversify the risk of disruption, many companies has been tempted to reduce their reliance on concentrate production in foreign country. Next. Next. Okay. So COVID-19 has a bad impact on natural resource-based investment. The fall was highly uneven across developing region. There's a decrease in 37% in Latin America and the Caribbean, a decrease in 18% in Africa, and decrease in 4% in developing countries in Asia. So the FDI to transition economies declined by 77% to 13 billions. The FDI contraction in Latin America and Caribbean was mainly due to the reduction of investment in the oil sector. The combination of collapsing oil price and the demand shock due to the pandemic affecting price of most commodities is driving down FDI forecasts in this region more than elsewhere. As for the Africa, the FDI inflow declined by 16% in 2020 from 47 billion to 40 billion. Because of the low price of energy commodities weighed heavily on foreign investment to the continent. However, COVID-19 has a good impact on the FDI on digital and pharmaceutical industry. India received the highest ever FDI inflow of 64.37 billion. The FDI inflow was 45.14 billion during 2014 to 2015 and 55.55 billion in the following year in the digital sector. This is because Apple set for new sales in India as FDI rules are relaxed. Apple and other tech giants will begin selling their product online in the Indian market thanks to the change of the country's foreign direct investment rules and a reform of its manufacturing restriction. Besides that, India also has a rise in FDI in the pharmaceutical industry. There is a 200% growth in FDI in pharmaceutical sector during 2020 to 2021, mainly on account of the COVID-19 pandemic. The extraordinary growth of foreign investment in pharma sector is mainly on account of investment to meet the COVID-19 related demand for therapeutics and vaccine. Indian pharmaceutical industry ranked in the world in production by volume. During 2020 to 2021, total pharma exports stood at 24.4 billion. Industry experts believe that India's pharmaceutical sector has gained renewable global attention due to the crisis brought about by COVID-19. With the FDI inflow firmly established India credential as safe and key investment destination in the world. So that's all for my presentation. Now I will pass to Yvonne to talk about the impact on banking sector.
Next. So banks are a key source of funding for Indian companies. Public sector financial institutions control about 70% of all banking assets in India, and they have had the highest exposure to bad loans. India's banking sector has been plagued with crises in recent years. Government's intention to set up asset management and reconstruction companies that together constitute a bad bank to provide financial stability to the banking sector. A bad bank is a bank set up to buy the bad loans and other illiquid holdings of another financial institution. The entity holding significant non-performing asset will sell the banking sector in India will sell these holdings to the bad bank at market price. This shows that even before the pandemic, the banking sector in India is already facing difficulties. So according to accounts from Punjab National Bank executives and government investigators, that a long middle-aged manager, later aided by his young subordinate, engineered fraudulent transactions totaling about 1.8 billion US dollar from 2011 to 2017. Next slide. The economic recession caused by COVID-19 threatens bank profitability, reduces bank income, and causes losses due to borrowers' inability to repay their bad debt. If the pandemic continues to cause difficulties for enterprises, international trade, and services, bad debt of the banking system will probably increase in the coming time. The performance and capacity of debtors in carrying out their credit obligations has been disrupted by the spread of COVID-19. This impact has the potential to present a disruption to the performance of banks in Indonesia and disrupt financial system stability, which ultimately affects Indonesia's economic growth. The reduced performance and capacity of these debtors can directly increase credit risk, which certainly disrupt banking performance and financial stability in Indonesia. The government's effort to overcome credit risk due to the spread of COVID-19 is to issue a policy of providing national economic stimulus to reduce the impact of COVID-19. As regards short-term effect of the second wave of the pandemic, that employment, productivity, and wages will decline, while prices, debt to GDP ratio, and size of the Reserve Bank of India's balance sheet will increase. A significant and positive influence of COVID-19 lockdown on the stock returns and liquidity of banking, finance, and insurance firms can be seen. Next, please. For the remittance inflow, the average remittance sent by every OFW from April to September 2020 was placed at 86.81 thousand pesos, lower than the average remittance value at 106.62 thousand pesos spent in 2019. In 2019, the total cash remittance sent through banks was estimated at 91.38 billion pesos. The number of overseas Filipino worker or SW in 2020 was estimated at 1.77 million, which was lower than the 2.18 million reported in 2019. The number of OCW, overseas contract workers, decreased to 1.71 million in 2020 from 4.11 million in 2019. Total remittance sent in 2020 reached 134.77 billion pesos, which was lower than the 210.40 billion pesos reported in 2019. On average, about 86.81 thousand pesos remittance per OFW was sent in 2020, an amount that is much lower than the 106.62 thousand pesos average remittance sent per OFW in 2019. Next slide, please. For remittance are a vital source of income for developing countries. The ongoing economic recession caused by COVID-19 is taking a severe toll on the ability to send money home and make it all the more vital that we shorten the time to recovery for advanced economics. Remittance impact positively on GDP growth when the financial markets are relatively undeveloped. The stock of international migrants is likely to decline as new migration has slowed and return migration has increased. Remittance also have contributed to economic growth through higher rate of capital accumulation in the banking system, which has also enhanced allocation of capital by reducing the credit constraint. A positive relationship between remittance and financial development by arguing that the demand for financial services could be increased during transferring or channeling of remittances into savings, and at the same time, remittance can be viewed as the alternative source of financing for the entrepreneurs who are unqualified for credit from mainstream commercial banks. In fact, it helps alleviate credit constraint on the investors, especially the poor who face credit constraint due to the lack of collateral, and thus remittance support entrepreneurial activities by improving the allocation of capital and therefore accelerating economic growth. Remittances have a positive impact on bank deposits and subsequently increase in GDP. Migrant workers who lost their employment are likely to reduce remittances to their families back home. Banks in migrant-source countries rely on remittance inflows as a cheap source of deposit funding since these flows are altruistically motivated. Remittance in Remittance flows to the East Asia and Pacific region are projected to fall by 11% in 2020 to 131 billion USD dollars due to the adverse impact of COVID-19. China and the Philippines are the region's top recipients, while as a share of GDP, the top recipients are Tonga and Samoa. And that's all from me. I will pass on to Ying.
Thanks, Yvonne. Taxation is part of the policy to mitigate the economic impact on COVID-19. And before the pandemic, the OECD tax revenues already decreased slightly before the pandemic, but it decreases even more, particularly from consumption taxes. Even before the COVID, many economies were in difficulty, but the pandemic only made the problems and taxation worse. If political approval is to be gained, tax will need effective policy communication and consensus building. Tax policy helps in economic growth in increasing the income and wealth distribution in a country. Therefore, governments are always looking for new and underutilized sources of tax income. So after COVID, the COVID crisis has caused a significant downturn in public finances, which calls for a rethink of tax and spending policies. Once the recovery is well underway, tax and expenditure are needed to increase tax collection and enhance the quality of government spending. According to IMF Managing Director Christine Lagarde, she also argues the expenditure assessment might help nations to identify priorities and places for savings and efficiency improvement. The COVID-19 dilemma might help in long-term productivity, for example, digitalization. Digitalization also has significant challenges to the functioning of personal tax system by facilitating taxpayer mobility as well as the rise of new forms of work and types of assets. Large recession, on the other hand, can have long-term and negative consequences on productivity. Containing measures increase government spending and lower tax revenue have driven an increase in budget deficit and government debt, which as a percentage of GDP has reached its highest level over the past several decades. Sustained periods of low economic growth undermine the tax revenue and make it difficult to address spending pressures, maintain public debt sustainability, and more generally, to improve population's living standards. The COVID-19 crisis could have positive effects on long-term productivity, for example, by accelerating digitalization, in particular, the adoption of digital technologies by small and medium-sized businesses in service sectors. However, large recession can have long-lasting and negative effects on some scarring effects could be mitigated by well-designed temporary job retention schemes that support productivity, enhancing job reallocation, according to Andrew et al. 2020. In the case of COVID-19 crisis, distribution in education are likely to reduce skill, productivity, and earnings of the current students, with possible negative effects on future GDP. According to UNICEF and Rossman 2020, higher economic growth will lower the debt to GDP ratio on its own. Towards the end, government should implement ambitious structural reforms to increase potential growth, according to OECD 2020. Okay. Actually, income and wealth tax rate after different contempt tax reforms. And for the impact on the taxation on financial mobility, lowering tax is not a good strategy, according to Martinez 2022. Tax cuts by the small Swiss canton of Norden, located in the central Switzerland, as an example, the goal was to attract high-income taxpayers, and this was to be achieved through the introduction of a regressive income and wealth tax schedule. In 2006, Norden changed its tax code and introduced a falling marginal tax rate for incomes beyond 300,000 Swiss francs (CHF). This corresponded roughly to the income threshold of the top 1% of Swiss taxpayers. The introduction of the regressive scheme implied that for a single taxpayer with taxable income of 500,000, approximately 512,000 gross income, the statutory average cantonal income tax rate fell from 17.9% to 14% after the reform. For an otherwise identical taxpayer with taxable income of 300,000, approximately 312,000 gross income, the average tax rate in contrast only fell from 17.6% to 16.6%, as illustrated in the next slide. The total tax roll would further include the federal income tax, which, however, is uniform across the canton and does not affect moving decision due to its regressive nature. The reform was repealed from the federal court in response to the court ruling in 2008. The canton introduced a flat tax rate which lowered the tax roll for top earners even further, since in Switzerland income and taxation is residence based. It was sufficient for taxpayers to move to Norden to take advantage of the low tax rate. Furthermore, the Swiss tax system does not distinguish between income from labor and capital. This reform therefore introduced a sharp, sizable, and very salient decrease in marginal and average tax rate, therefore exploit variation over time across cantons and across different groups of taxpayers to identify the good effect of this pro-rich policy in Norden. Using federal income tax data, the population share of high-income taxpayers living in a canton and net income taxpayer in Norden in comparison to other cantons in a differences setting. Results from the corresponding event study indicate that reform had the intended effect to obtain a comparable measure of the effects of tax rate changes. Economists typically compute the elasticity with respect to the net of average tax rate. A 1% increase in the net of average tax rate increase the inflow of top earners by up to 7.2%. Elasticity are larger in settings without restriction, income source, nationality, or origin to take advantage of the lower taxes in another jurisdiction. This is also why theory in fact predict that small jurisdictions will on average benefit from engaging in tax competition, while larger jurisdictions will lose. Even study estimate comparing the cantonal tax revenue in Upwardens with the revenue in other cantons show that the reform did not increase revenue. Upwardens total tax revenue rose over time, but personal tax revenue in other cantons rose even more in comparison. This is therefore also about what the right counterfactual is when evaluating a policy. Conclusion. The pandemic has an impact on the investment global FDI force, bad impact on resources. However, it has a good impact on the digital and pharmaceutical sectors. The pandemic also has an impact on the banking sector, such as bad loans, bad debts, and the remittance inflow. However, it helps in GDP growth. Lastly, it also increased tax collection and government spending in the country. However, taxation can help in economic growth. That is all from our group. Here are our references.